Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We apologize for having this event at such an early hour. However, with the hearing for Attorney General McDonald coming up, this was really the only time that made sense today. We're here today laying out our agenda because 2021 has the potential to be a transformative year for New Hampshire, with the chance to get our economy thriving again, to expand educational opportunity for students, and to strengthen our rights to free speech, privacy, and worker freedom. That's why we're announcing our 2021 AFP New Hampshire legislative agenda, a list of our top 10 priority pieces of legislation that will help move our state forward and give granite staters their best chance of living the New Hampshire advantage. To talk through these bills, we have a number of our sponsors joining us to point out how their legislation will benefit our state's residents. As for the format, I'll quickly introduce each bill on our agenda and give an explanation as to why we've prioritized it. Then when available, we'll have the prime sponsor speak to their bills. After we finish all 10, we will open it up for questions and answers from the media. So we're going to go slightly out of order from our agenda since we have Speaker Packard joining us, who does have other time commitments, and he's here to speak to the two pieces of legislation that he has prime sponsored. The first bill of Speaker Packard on our agenda is House Bill 10, legislation to provide tax relief to New Hampshire's employers. We have made this issue a longstanding priority for AFP for years, and we are supporting this bill for two major reasons. First, the state's history with employer tax relief since 2015 has demonstrated the value of making our state more competitive. The results have been more jobs, faster growing wages, the highest inbound migration of any state in the Northeast, and the strongest economy in the region since we began this effort. And importantly, record business tax revenues. That's right, here in New Hampshire, we have shown that lowering tax rates has increased tax revenues as our economy has expanded. The second reason is that because the state reversed this positive trend in the last legislature. According to the surplus statement from the last budget, there were over $41 million in increased business taxes in this fiscal year alone. House Bill 10 corrects that tax hike by lowering the tax burden on our employers and does so in a way that particularly benefits small businesses. That's why we're so supportive of this bill and why we're thrilled to have Speaker Packard here to speak to his legislation. And with that, I'll turn it over to the Speaker.
Thanks, Greg. Well, I think as everybody knows, these were the two prime pieces of legislation that, Dick Hench had, and he had sponsored himself. And with the unfortunate passing of Dick, I took over the prime sponsorship of him. For months, I mean, Dick and I crisscrossed the state. And one of the biggest things we kept hearing from small businesses, we could use some more relief and we could use some more help. And so this was put at the top of our agenda, this and the other one that you're going to be talking about. This was put at the top of our agenda as one of the two prime bills that we want to get sponsored. We get passed. And so we're going to do everything. And I'm confident that we will pass this bill because it is of high priority, the very highest priority for us in this session. We're going to do everything we can to try and do to make sure that we help the businesses as much as possible, especially with this pandemic, and so many of them have been hit hard. This is just, it's not a big discount, but it will help. Every little bit helps. Having been a small business owner myself for 45 years, every bit helps. This hopefully will help hire people. It will help maybe purchase new equipment, refurbish old equipment. And so we're moving forward 100% on this. Will it come out exactly the way it is right now? Who knows? But we're going to make sure that we get this passed and send it over to the Senate.
Awesome. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But don't go too far because we have another critical bill that you filed coming right up. That's House Bill 20, legislation that creates the Richard Hinch Education Freedom Account Program. We support House Bill 20 because for too long we forced children and families into a one-size-fits-all system that dictates students' educational experience based upon where they live. We need to reevaluate our students' educational experiences, especially as the pandemic has exposed even more cracks in our system. It's time to come together and embrace education policies that allow every child to unleash their extraordinary potential. Today, we believe the potential of every child, and that means we need an education system that's responsive to the needs of individual children and families, not forcing children to try to adapt to a one-size-fits-all system. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Speaker Packard to talk about House Bill 20.
Thank you again, Greg. Well, I'm not going to get into any of the details of it because this thing's been amended 2 or 3 times already, and it probably have some more minor amendments. But this is another one of the absolute highest priorities for us. Because as Republicans, we all know, we believe in doing everything we can to help children get educated and get the best education they can get. And unlike the Democrats who want to shut down all kind of shut down charter schools, stop funding charter schools, stop any type of legislation as this, and to pander to the teachers, we're going to push this thing forward. It will come out of committee and it will pass. I can't speak for maybe John. Senator Reagan can speak to the Senate part of it, but you know, this is again in the top, you know, along with the budget and redistricting, this is in the top 5 bills that we want to get passed this session. And this, we have no doubt in our mind, will help the students in this state get a better education. And that's what we should all be gearing for, is a better education for the kids. That's the main reason that we're pushing this one so hard. It's just another step on helping the children in this state and giving them some options.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, for joining us and for your leadership on these important issues. We'll move on to our next priority bill. That's Senate Bill 61, sponsored by Senator John Regan, which would deliver right-to-work protection for New Hampshire private sector workers. As many know, over 2.5 years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court ensured that no public sector worker would have to join or pay a union as a condition of employment in the Janus ruling. Senate Bill 61 would extend those same protections to private sector workers here in the Granite State. In doing so, New Hampshire would become the first right-to-work state in the Northeast, which would give us a huge advantage in attracting good new jobs, particularly in the manufacturing sector. We've released studies in 2014 and 2016 that demonstrate the positive economic impact of New Hampshire becoming a right-to-work state. Protecting the freedom of workers across the states remains the primary reason why we support this legislation. With that, I'll turn it over to Senator John Regan to speak to Senate Bill 61. Senator?
Well, this is probably my 5th attempt to pass a right-to-work law. I myself have been a dues-paying union member for approaching 60 years, and I see the value of collective bargaining, and I also see the damage done by interfering with the normal employee-employer relations. So that's my desire to see happen with right to work, is that we return that that fair bargaining between the employer and the employee, that it puts the employer on the burden of providing a more attractive workplace than his competitor with. So anywhere you can inject competition, you get better pricing and you get a better product. And I think that the right to work will lead to this.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Senator. We'll move to another important topic, which is legislation to phase out New Hampshire's loan income tax. One could certainly argue that last November's election at the state level was a referendum on the income tax. That said, many people don't realize that New Hampshire certainly does have an income tax, an interest in dividend income. Moreover, according to the Department of Revenue Administration data, the majority of I&D taxpayers in New Hampshire are seniors. While some of the earlier bills we've touched on would benefit working age people and those about to enter the workforce, here in New Hampshire, and that's important, helping them out. However, House Bills 568 would be a big benefit to retirees across the state. Certainly it was not lost on us when we saw Governors Cuomo of New York and Murphy of New Jersey employ high net worth seniors not to leave their states. And yet here in New Hampshire, we have a mechanism in the I&D tax to send our seniors to states like Florida and Tennessee that don't tax this type of income. And they take their resources and the economic value they provide to our state with them when they leave. The time is now to begin to phase out this last vestige of an income tax in New Hampshire. With that, I don't know if has Representative Silver joined us?
Representative Silver should be here. Representative, I've unmuted you, giving you the option to unmute.
Greg, can you hear me? It's Norm.
We can. Go ahead, Representative.
Okay, this is Representative Norm Silver from Belknap 2. My bill 568 basically is sort of a redo. In 17, I tried to do an outright repeal of the I&D tax, and that got killed in committee. People seem to be very concerned about the so-called hole in the budget created if we eliminate the tax, about $80 million. So notwithstanding that I explained that if we eliminated it, the way to deal with the hole in the budget is to cut spending, it still died. So this time, the approach I've taken is that the filing threshold, which stands at $2,400 for individuals and a double that amount for married couples, would increase in the first year, would double, it would triple the next year, quadruple the next year, and finally, in the fourth year, it would be completely phased out. What I'd like to point out, of course, is that the RSA Chapter 77 is called taxation of incomes. And we like to, tout all over the country, New Hampshire doesn't have an income tax, but the reality is we do have an income tax. And there's certainly been, people have heard a lot of anecdotes about people moving to Florida from New Hampshire, not only because of the weather, but because there is no tax on investment income. It seems to me that this tax seems to hit people disproportionately, working people who've been very careful with their finances and have been able to save and invest money, whether in stocks or bonds or even savings accounts, and you know that you're not getting much interest these days. Still, our 5% tax it's a flat 5%. It doesn't increase or decrease. Once you get over the threshold, it's a flat 5%. So it's actually higher than a lot of states in the country that have a actual admitted state income tax. So that 5% does hurt seniors and hurt savers and investors, and we just like to phase it out. That's the whole story.
Well, again, thank you for joining us, Norm. I'll now introduce our Deputy State Director, Ross Conley, who carries part of our legislative portfolio to talk about our next bill. Ross?
Okay, I'm gonna go off, Greg, because I'm at the hearing on the nomination for State Supreme Court, so I'm going to walk into that hearing now.
Thank you so much for joining us, Ross.
Thanks, Greg. Take care.
Greg. So, but hey, thank you for all you do.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So the first bill I wanted to highlight is HB 405, which has to do with universal recognition of out-of-state occupational licenses. As we know, the pandemic has exposed a lot of barriers in our economy, and one in particular has really stood out, which is regulatory red tape tying the hands of licensed professionals who want to move to New Hampshire and contribute to our communities, but this smothers progress and economic well-being for those in those professions. And HB 405, which is sponsored by Representative Michael Harrington, who unfortunately couldn't join us today, but this bill would allow for a much easier transition for licensed workers in another state to move to the Granite State and work here. During the COVID-19 pandemic, it was quickly realized that unnecessary regulatory barriers were going to hinder our state from having the medical staff capacity needed in order to address the crisis. And through executive action, Governor Sununu suspended these requirements in the medical field. And it's now time we extend this recognition to all licensed professionals and to help our economy bounce back. These workers have already been trained and licensed in other states, many of which have much more onerous requirements for licensure than New Hampshire. And we believe they shouldn't have to jump through more hoops to start working in the Granite State. Our state should embrace new residents who wish to contribute to our communities, but we must have New Hampshire regulations reflect that welcoming spirit. All people should be able to live free and work without being suffocated by red tape. And as I mentioned, Representative Harrington unfortunately couldn't join us today, so I'll turn it back over to Greg to carry the next bill.
Thanks, Ross. We'll now turn to another important issue, protecting the privacy of our data. Today, most everyone has a laptop and a smartphone that stores data in the cloud. However, what most people don't know is that there is no right to privacy for that data. Under current federal Supreme Court rulings, there is no need for law enforcement to get a warrant to snoop through our private data that's in the cloud. This runs contrary to the views of New Hampshire voters who overwhelmingly, with 81% of the vote, passed a privacy constitutional amendment to our state constitution back in 2018. House Bill 597, sponsored by Representative Keith Erf, helps to close that loophole by requiring law enforcement and other agencies to get a warrant before accessing private data. Fundamentally, this starts putting the flesh on the bones of the constitutional amendment and has broad bipartisan support in the House last year before the COVID impact on the legislature shut down this bill in the Senate. It's time to restore our privacy rights, and House Bill 597 does just that. Now, Representative Erf is in a training, and he wasn't able to join us today, so I want to recognize him and appreciate the hard work he's put in this important area, working with one of his constituents, former Representative Neil Kirk, on this important privacy issue. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Ross for our next bill on the agenda.
Sure. Next up is HB 331, which has to do with strengthening protections from asset forfeiture. There's a lot of bills that should gain broad support across partisan divides this year, and HB 331 is definitely one of those bills. In 2016, our state passed a law that restricted how police can forfeit seized property by requiring a conviction before the forfeiture process can occur. However, state agencies have been circumventing that law by using a federal Justice Department program called equitable sharing. This allows the state agency to forfeit property without a conviction and to keep up to 80% of the forfeitures. This is policing for profit, plain and simple. It breeds distrust in our justice system and police. This bill would simply close that loophole to ensure state agencies are following existing state statute, specifically RSA 617:1-A, which was passed into law by a GOP majority in 2016. A recent YouGov poll conducted in September 2020 showed that 70% of Americans oppose the equitable sharing program. Such a divide between law enforcement and public opinion is a recipe for the distrust we see in our justice system today. This must be corrected to ensure our justice system has the trust to carry out its critical business of keeping Granite Staters safe. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Representative Michael Sylvia, who's the prime sponsor of this bill, to speak to his legislation.
Thank you, Ross. I've been working on asset forfeiture since before the criminal asset forfeiture bill passed. Dan McGuire did a great job with that. And we are continuing to push for the closing of that loophole that allows law enforcement to essentially fund themselves. The state forfeiture law, when there is a criminal conviction, gives the local law enforcement departments 45% of the assets that come from that. And the federal program, equitable sharing, a totally civil process, no criminal conviction required, actually gives them a larger portion of the assets that are seized, 80% of the profit. And that money goes into their budgets, but it's not even tracked. It goes into their funding of various portions of the enforcement actions that are not typically budgeted. Budgeting is a legislative process. We should not be allowing agencies of government anywhere to be creating their own revenue stream. This is a very offensive program. Occasionally there's talk about the federal government shutting down its equitable sharing program. And perhaps with a new administration, there'll be more focus on that, because we know that this program really targets the folks that are on the lower end of the income spectrum. Most of these forfeitures, over 95%, are under $10,000. And looking at a lot of the evidence, $2,000 seems to be a real sweet spot. For $2,000, someone who has their property taken cannot afford a lawyer to go retrieve that property. They just give it up. And this is highly offensive. And we know that this does not get the real high level drug kingpins, as they say. And the bill as it's written has a $100,000 break-off point where the local agencies can go to the federal government for equitable sharing. And the thought process on that is that at $100,000, you're talking about perhaps a very big and large organized criminal operation. And at that point, the resources of the federal government for prosecution may be necessary. So that's where we made the break point. And but most of this, 95% of this is taking money from people who cannot afford to fight their own battles. And I'm glad to have AFP on board and joining us in this battle. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Mike. The next bill on our agenda focuses on expanding the work done in a broad bipartisan fashion 2 years ago to legalize direct primary care. Direct primary care offers the opportunity of high quality, personalized, patient-centered care that is affordable. In 2019, the General Court passed legislation that freed direct primary care providers from cumbersome insurance regulations that would have made it impossible to offer those services here. House Bill 290 this year takes the next step in this model by allowing direct payment facilities to open to support those patients and practitioners who want to choose this option of care. To talk more about this, we have the sponsor, Representative Mark McLean. Mark?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. I think, what HB 290 does, I think, essentially, as you pointed out, is it recognizes that the people of New Hampshire, there's an enormous amount of diversity in the way in which they pursue how they're going to get their health care. And so it moves the healthcare marketplace just incrementally in a direction of more openness and more options for the people of New Hampshire. And it does that by building on the bipartisan direct primary care relationship that we brought about in the last term, and it actually extends that model beyond the providers themselves and allows it to go into the healthcare facilities. So if a healthcare facility opts to go down and pursue exclusively a direct payment model, then the licensing burden that is really designed for those that receive third-party payments is lifted. And so what that does is that allows those folks, those providers that are exercising the direct payment model as providers, it allows them to come together and form facilities that are going to offer additional services, maybe simple procedures, testing such as x-rays, ultrasound, MRI, things of that. And so what that does then, I think, is it really allows for the building of critical mass around this, because you're just incrementally expanding it out. And that's illegal under the current law right now. But by making that legal and allowing you to achieve that critical mass, you're really giving that direct payment model a better chance of success.
Thank you so much, Mark. And we appreciate your work on this important topic. Next, I'll turn it back over to Ross for our next piece of legislation. Ross?
Sure. For the last one on the agenda for me is HB 234, which has to do with protecting free speech rights on public college campuses. It's obviously no secret that our country has significant political and cultural divides right now. And this requires us now more than ever to respectfully speak to one another to better understand opposing positions. When we do this, we'll find we have a lot more in common than we think. And HB 234, sponsored by Representative Joe Alexander, would require New Hampshire public institutions of higher learning to adopt free speech into their student handbooks and codes of conduct. In America, we should all be able to voice our opinion, and the public can determine what is mainstream and what should rightly be dismissed. We must teach younger generations how essential free speech is to the continuation of our republic. And this bill would make New Hampshire universities a beacon for students and parents across the nation and world that we respect openness of opinion, diversity of thought, and an end to political divisiveness. More speech, not less, is required for our nation to come together and bridge these political and cultural divides. And this bill will go a long way towards fostering that environment in the future. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Representative Alexander to speak on his bill.
Thank you, Ross. So as Ross said, free speech is under attack around this country. Private companies like Twitter have set a dangerous precedent by banning the former president from Twitter. This bill seeks to further enshrine protections for all speech on our public colleges and universities. The text of this bill finds that the ideas of different members of public post-secondary educational institutional communities will often and quite naturally conflict, but it is not the proper role of public post-secondary educational institutions to attempt to shield individuals from ideas and opinions they find unwelcome, disagreeable, or even deeply offensive. And that's what this bill does, is it protects all speech. In today's world, it's now more important than ever that we further enshrine this in statute. Thank you, Ross.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Ross, and thank you, Representative Alexander. Our final bill on our legislative agenda is a simple one, but one that has a long history. Back in 2012, when I was serving as the House Chief of Staff, we passed legislation to ensure that New Hampshire wouldn't get stuck in a big regional gas tax hike scheme without any legislative involvement. However, at the time, we wanted to make sure that New Hampshire still had a seat at the table to see what our neighboring states might have in mind for such a plan. Well, now we know what that scheme is. It's called the Transportation and Climate Initiative, or TCI, which amounts to a major backdoor gas tax hike. According to a Tufts University study, the TCI, as it's currently proposed, would amount to a gas tax hike of 30 cents per gallon or more. Worse yet, the express goal of TCI is to raise gas prices to the point where they are unaffordable, which would represent an ongoing ratcheting up of gas taxes each year on New Hampshire drivers. Now that we have seen what TCI is, there is no reason to continue to spend our limited state resources on studying its effect or how it should be developed. For that, we'd like to turn it over to House Majority Whip Representative Janine Otter to talk about her bill, House Bill 373. Janine?
Thank you, Greg. I have with me a copy of the bill, House Bill 373. Like you said, it might be the simplest one we vet all year. Taking out 6 words and changing them to "we shall not participate" will save Granite Staters some of their hard-earned money. TCI is a regressive gas tax increase that harms those who can least afford it, like the elderly on fixed incomes, the working poor, or those who commute to work like my adult children do. They can't afford to have to pay more at the pump. It's unfair to place this burden on their backs. I despise tax increases because it's never just for one thing. It causes increases for everything connected to it. Like nearly every product that we buy at the store is delivered by trucks. TCI would drive up the cost of goods because it will cost more to run the trucks that deliver them. The increase is then passed along to the consumers. TCI would continue to raise these taxes for years to come. However, unlike the legislature, where our constituents can hold us accountable for tax increases that hurt them in the wallet, TCI shifts the responsibility of raising gas taxes to an unelected and unaccountable board. The public deserves the right to know and hold responsible the people who are taking money out of their pocket. For these reasons, there is no longer any reason to study TCI. We know the results and what it would do to our constituents and our economy. We have already spent 800 hours, here we go, here's my little chart, in staff time and nearly $50,000 on this scheme. It's time to pull the plug on TCI. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Notter. We'll now turn it over to the question and answers from the media. To handle that, I'd like to introduce Kevin Briniger, who handles communications for us. Kevin, do we have any questions?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending. For any members of the press, if you have questions on the agenda and any of the bills featured on the agenda, please raise your hand, which you can click on below, and we will take your questions.
We had a few folks join in, Kevin, via phone. If I don't see any hands raised, I may click to allow them to talk, if that's all right with you, just in case they're unable to unmute themselves.
Yeah, that works.
Okay, well, we did such a great job of explaining the legislation. There's no questions at all. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk through this important legislative agenda that can truly have a transformative impact upon New Hampshire and set us up for future progress going forward. So I really appreciate particularly all the legislators who've joined us today. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.